This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. In recent months, mass testing and vaccinations against COVID-19 have occurred inside Connecticut's prisons. 19 incarcerated people in our state have died from the virus. But now that a full year has passed since the pandemic began, how will leaders work to address systemic issues in the state's correctional system, like the continued use of solitary confinement? Today, Where We Live, we talk about efforts to end this practice. Coming up, we hear from members of Stop Solitary CT. We also hear the latest on how leaders plan to close some prisons as the incarcerated population continues to decline. First, joining us is Kellen Lyons, a reporter who covers justice for the Connecticut Mirror, and he's a Report for America Corps member. Kellen, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to just get an update on the fact that it has been a year now since the pandemic began, and I wanted to learn how this virus continues to affect people inside Connecticut's prisons and jails. So can you tell us the latest in terms of not only mass testing, but the vaccination campaign inside prisons?
Sure. So the vaccination rollout is continuing. Roughly 46% of the incarcerated population has been vaccinated as of yesterday. As of yesterday, also 4,352 incarcerated folks have had COVID, which is a number that equates to about half of the prison population as of yesterday's numbers, although the population has changed and declined over the course of the pandemic. It's tough to say where that fits in nationally as far as our vaccinations go, because different states have had different policies. Some states haven't even started to roll out the vaccine quite yet. But our staff vaccination rates are about in line with the rest of the nation, which is about 48%, around half. That's what we're seeing nationwide as well. As far as life is sort of starting to go back to normal. In some ways. I mean, the big things, there's no contact visits that are back. Each prison has a different policy, but for the most part, it seems as though housing units are staying together. Guys aren't locked in their cells for quite as long as they were toward the beginning of the pandemic. Recreation time is being increased a little bit in certain facilities. There are still no volunteers going into the facilities, but it looks like things are starting to somewhat approach normalcy compared to what it was this time last year.
Just recap something that you shared, Kellen. Did you say about half the incarcerated population has had COVID?
Well, it's tough to say because the numbers have changed so much. There are about 3,000 fewer people who are in prison as of right now, 3,500 fewer in prison right now than there were on March 1st. So I was just simply saying that the figure that of the number of people who have had COVID is equivalent to half of what the incarcerated population is today. But I wouldn't say that half of the people who have been in prison have caught COVID. It's just a matter of how the population has changed since March 1st of 2020.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying that. We know that there are people who are incarcerated that have pre-existing conditions. And I'm wondering, early on in the pandemic, we heard from loved ones and advocates that were really concerned about this and the fact that, they weren't able to be released, technically, all of them through discretionary release, which is something that advocates wanted to see more of. And so what's happening now with prisoners with pre-existing conditions?
Well, I've done a lot of reporting on how the DOC has tried to up its use of discretionary releases. Advocates and people who have incarcerated loved ones have been calling for more discretionary releases, more widespread discretionary releases. The incarcerated population has changed in that the DOC has made efforts to release folks who are there on less serious conditions. One interesting data point of note is that for years, violation of probation was the most common sentence that folks were serving in prisons and jails. And now it's murder. So it can kind of shows that some of the less serious offenses are at least attempting to be weeded out. I mean, violation of probation is now the second most common, but it still shows that more serious offenses are being served. As far as vulnerable populations, there are bills in the legislature to try to expand folks who will be eligible for, say, compassionate release, parole or medical parole. But the laws on the books are still the laws on the books. Last I heard, the commutation process was still not online, and the compassionate release laws are still quite narrow. So for many folks, there's still a pretty narrow way for them to get out of prison before the end of their sentence.
We've been talking about the incarcerated population, but what about the staff and the COs, the correctional officers who are also in those prisons each day? Have they been wearing masks, Kellen? This is something that's come up in recent months. And what are other precautions? Because they're the ones that are coming in and out of these prisons.
Mask wearing has been probably by correction staff has been probably the thing I've been hearing about the most over the course of the pandemic. I heard it a lot more earlier in that staff were not complying with mask mandates. I mean, the governor issued an executive order, and the Department of Correction commissioner told me that, so long as they are within 6 feet of anyone, they have to be wearing a mask, but otherwise they do not need to wear it. I had heard that staff were generally flouting that. But on December 24th of last year, right before the end of the year, the Department of Correction or commissioner issued this directive that required correction officers to wear the masks, covering their nose at all times. So that seems to have gotten better since then.
Well, that's good to hear. When we think about, again, so much of the attention was how to protect the incarcerated population from COVID-19, but there's been a push in recent years for more accountability and reforms of the Connecticut prison system. And so I'm wondering how those conversations are starting to happen now, Kellen. What can you tell us?
So the legislature is considering a bill that would create correction ombuds. There's a couple different ways that the legislature is considering essentially creating a watchdog that would hold the Department of Correction accountable. Because as of right now, there's not really a way to hold them accountable beyond lawmakers passing reforms. So there's a bill that I think we'll be talking about later in the hour called the PROTECT Act that would create this Office of Ombuds within the Department of Correction, which actually used to exist years ago, but was because of funding issues was disbanded. Essentially, it would investigate allegations of abuse or allegations of misconduct and serve as a watchdog for the incarcerated population. And there would also be a 9-member commission that would appoint the correction ombuds and work with that ombuds office to create a sort of more systemic series of reforms for the DOC. So we've seen that play out in public hearings at the legislature, and it's been interesting to hear correction commissioner talk about it, who's appears to be open to it, as well as advocates who've been clamoring for this for years, because these prisons they're simply a black box. I mean, especially in the past year where there's been no one really going in except for corrections staff. Visits have opened up a little bit, but for the most part, we haven't been in or seen the prisons in a long time.
You mentioned that overall the prison population has continued to decrease. This is something that the DOC commissioner, the new DOC commissioner Quiros, is also thinking about in their proposals to close some prisons. Update us on where things stand, Kellen.
Yeah, so on March 1st of 2020, there were over 12,400 people who were in prison or jail. On March 29th of this year, there were 8,960. That's a serious decline. So there are almost 3,500 fewer people behind bars today than there were at the beginning of the pandemic. It's worth noting that racial disparities have actually increased a little bit since then as well. We went from 70 to 72% of those who are in prisons or jails are Black or Hispanic. Whites make up 27% of the prison population, but about 2/3 of state residents overall. But that decline in the incarcerated population is a huge part of the commissioner's decision to close 3 correctional facilities by the end of the biennium. So within the next couple of years, one of which has already been announced.
And that's Northern, which is notorious, considering it is the supermax, and this is the place where individuals who had been sentenced to die for their crimes, when the state abolished the death penalty, they're now serving life sentences. So they're the ones that are still at Northern, Kellen?
Yes, those men are still there. There's only eight men there on what are called special circumstances status who are formerly on death row. There's 1 man who's still technically on death row, but there's a host of folks there who are there on administrative segregation, different forms of isolated confinement, primarily which are used to curb behavior and to essentially get people transition to go back to the general incarcerated population. The last I checked, there were about 70 people at Northern.
Now, coming up again, we're going to be talking about efforts to drastically reduce the use of solitary confinement in Connecticut prisons. But when we think about this pandemic and the importance of social distancing, what has that meant for people who are incarcerated? Are they spending more time in their cells, Kellen?
Yeah, that. In letters that I have received and from talking to family members, that has been probably one of the hardest things that folks who are incarcerated have had to deal with. I mean, there's been no volunteers going in, so those who were lucky enough to have access to higher education or college classes have been unable to meet with their college professors. Most of the time, guys have been locked in their cells for long periods of time. It's really just been a really isolating year. And so they've had to rely on the phone to call their loved ones. But oftentimes that could get disrupted because the unit is on lockdown or there's been a disciplinary issue, so nobody has access to phones. It's been quite a year for incarcerated people and for their families who have been, they haven't been able to touch them. There's been no contact visits that have been restored since before the pandemic.
You're hearing Kellen Lyons here on Where We Live. He's a reporter who covers justice for the Connecticut Mirror. Kellen's going to stick around, and after the break, we're going to talk more about this issue of solitary confinement. It's something that is still used in Connecticut prisons today, and you can join the conversation. We're going to learn more about this practice. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Last September, I spoke to Stowe Prize winner Albert Wood Fox, who spent more than 40 years in solitary confinement at Louisiana State Penitentiary, a former plantation. He wrote about his experience in the book Solitary, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Wood Fox told me, when you're confined to a 6-foot by 9-foot cell for 23 hours a day, it's like you're fighting to breathe. This excerpt in his book still stands out to me. He writes, "Living in concrete, you get used to the noise. Sound bounces off the floors and walls and echoes. When someone on the tier cracked, you'd hear him cry or scream. Some guys would moan for hours or days." Solitary confinement happens inside Connecticut prisons, too. The Department of Correction calls it administrative segregation. The state says, unlike other states, the practice here does not follow indefinite time frames. But there are efforts by community members to drastically reduce solitary confinement in our state. Joining us now on Zoom is Barbara Fair, lead organizer and member of the steering committee for Stop Solitary CT. Barbara, welcome to the show.
Hi. Good morning.
Also with us is Leighton Johnson, public education coordinator and a member of the steering committee for the same organization, Stop Solitary CT. Leighton, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
So Barbara, I'll start with you. I know you've been involved in this work to end solitary confinement in our state for a number of years. So when we talk about solitary confinement, can you describe this practice for us?
Well, according to Department of Corrections, they name it all different kinds of names, and Leighton can get more into all the various names. But as far as we're concerned, anyone who's in the cell for over 22 hours a day, that by United Nations own definition is solitary confinement and torture. So as I said, Leighton can tell you more about the actual different names that the Department of Corrections uses for solitary, but initially that's what it's about, in being isolated away from other people for that many hours a day.
And what are the reasons that Department of Correction gives for putting people in solitary confinement, Barbara?
Well, many times the marketing that they use is these are the worst of the worst. They're the most violent individuals, and their very common phrase, which I feel is much overused, is all about public safety.
It's interesting you bring that up. Someone tweeted at us, I'm going to quote here, "Solitary confinement is necessary for managing violent and assaultive inmates. To ban it would be dangerous to the staff and inmate population." So respond to that comment again, because this is something that in the general public, I'm sure is shared.
Well, they have to market that. I mean, that's how people go along with it. If they really believe that we're locking up all these violent and vicious criminals, then people will go along with what they're doing. If you look at just say, for instance, how they marketed Northern, they said the people are in there are the worst of the worst. But if you ever talk to the people that's in there, and we get many letters from them, they're not the worst of the worst. And I can say that personally because my son at the age of 17 was placed in Northern. And he wasn't the worst of the worst. His only problem was he resisted the abusive treatment that the correctional officers used. Many times the prisoners just adapted to that abusive conditions. And so when anyone resisted in any way, that was a threat to the safety of the correctional. So they put him in Northern. So people who want to keep places like Northern open or keep the abuse, solitary confinement going, will always market to the public who don't know any better. They will always market. It's really about safety for the staff, for other people. It's all these bad, violent people, but that's not, in fact, who's in there.
I understand in your work, Barbara, obviously benchmarking, looking at how other states have approached this practice. Other states have banned solitary confinement. So when we hear that this practice is not being used in prison, what is the research, the data telling us about what that means in terms of reducing violence versus trying to prevent it?
Well, one of the things that there was a Rick Ramish in Colorado. He was the executive director in Colorado prisons. And what he did is actually went and stayed in a cell for 20 hours out of a day just to get the experience of being isolated. And what he said is that at the end of the day, he realized that segregating people, putting people in isolation didn't reduce violence. It actually increased violence and increased intense anxiety and fear and paranoia and, all kind of mental illnesses. So when people say that this actually helps, it doesn't help in any way. And many of the states are finding that out, and they are working their way away from solitary confinement. But Connecticut's just been a little slow in getting there.
You're hearing Barbara Fair again here on Where We Live. She's lead organizer and member of the steering committee for Stop Solitary CT. Also with us is Leighton Johnson, who's a member of this organization as well. Leighton, you were formerly incarcerated. You spent some time at Northern. And so I wanted to ask you, when we talk about solitary confinement, what do you want the public to know about this practice?
Well, as Ms. Barbara said, and as a lot of us know, solitary is used in a bunch of different forms. So it's torture no matter what they put it. It's used for just segregation, just regular so-called population. It's used to control people. And like Ms. Barbara said, the smallest of infractions can get you in segregation. So contrary to people's belief that in society, that people who go to segregation or, administrative segregation or whatever form, RHU, SHU, the gang unit, whatever they want to call it, that people are going there because they're violent. And that's far from the truth. And I can speak from my own experience and also from the experience of a lot of incarcerated individuals that I was with in Northern CI.
So, Leighton, if you don't mind me asking, tell us about what it was like to be isolated and some of the reasons why you were put in solitary confinement during your time.
Oh, wow. We would have to be here for a long time for me to really, get you to understand what it's like. But I was sent to Northern CI from having a fight, and I had a fight. This happened to have been my fourth ticket. Ticket being a disciplinary action that you receive within a short period of time. About 4-month period time, and I had only been in prison for about a year on a 10-year sentence. It was kind of hard to adjust to that, and just understanding that I had a 10-year sentence in this oppressive, you know, environment. The other tickets that I did receive weren't any, in violence or anything. They was what the Department of Corrections like to give out a lot was disobeying a direct order. So you can get a disobeying a direct order ticket for various um, things, even to the point of not getting off the phone fast enough when you're talking to your loved one, or not, locking up fast enough, getting out the shower too slow, and you can get a disciplinary ticket. And they have it in their directives that if you catch 4 tickets, no matter what the tickets are, within a certain amount of period, now you're eligible to go to Northern on chronic disciplinary um, status. And now you're in there with, the people who are so-called the worst of the worst, if people wants to call them that. But like I said, the majority of people who are in there for small infractions.
What was the longest time that you were in solitary confinement, Leighton, and how did that affect you even years later?
Um, I I spent between the two different times that I went there, and both for being for having a fight. Um, Between the two times, I spent 5 years inside, and then also on top of that, just my stints in going to segregation for whatever reasons, small infractions, not violence, anything of that nature. It's an innumerable amount of time, but solitary confinement is specifically in Northern. That really, 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 does something to your psyche. Could you just imagine um, being inside of um, a small cell, no TV, the walls are bare. There's really no air for you to breathe because of how the cell is made. It's freezing cold in the wintertime because they keep the air on blast for whatever reason, and then you can get a ticket if you cover the vent. So either you have to just deal with the cold air, or you can risk getting a ticket for trying to stay warm. And then in the summertime, it's extremely hot to the point where even the toilet and everything in the cell is sweating because it's a concrete and a metal cell. So just imagine being in this place for 23 hours a day, sometimes, and this is during the week, sometimes 24 hours a day, because you're at the whim of the officers. And a lot of the time when I was in there, the officers had just basically free will to treat us however they wanted to. So if they came to your cell at 7 in the morning, they said, did you want rec? And you was, sleeping, and you jumped up, you said yes, but you didn't move fast enough for them. They would say, well, you're all set, and you just try again tomorrow. Lock the door, and now you're locked in for 24 hours. Um, and on the weekends, it's 48 hours. You don't come out on the weekends. You get 3 showers a week, and that's if they choose to let you out. Everywhere you go, you're chained up, full restraints, um, like a slave. I could still hear the sounds of the chains dragging on the floor. I was diagnosed with PTSD since I've come home. Um, I also, which something I've never spoke of, but I've also have lipomas, which are you know these fatty deposits on my arms, like lumps, and to the point where I thought they was cancer at one time, and I was a little nervous. And I've never had any of these issues, including high blood pressure that I did develop when I was inside, that I've overcome. But I've never had any of these issues until I went through the experience of solitary confinement. Um,
Well, thank you for describing that, Leighton Johnson, who's a member of Stop Solitary CT. Barbara Fair is still with us. Leighton did an excellent job describing what this was like for him. And I wanted you, Barbara, to talk more about how this practice impacts mental health, both in the short and long term.
I can tell you, just before I get to that, because I'm sitting here and I'm listening to Leighton and I'm getting anxious. So that's one of the byproducts of what families have to face, knowing that their loved ones went through this. Is when my son was in Northern, I spent nights awake, crying, having panic attacks. I would get up in the middle of the night and go to my door because I felt I didn't have enough air to breathe. I felt like my son was pulling on my spirit and crying out for me. And so I was a mental wreck as well. And he's been out like 20 years, and I still, when I go back to reliving that, I still get full of anxiety. So I'm trying to calm that as I talk. Some of the things the mental health issues that people experience in there are depression, intense anxiety, visual and auditory hallucinations, depression, insomnia, paranoia. Some commit suicide, and as Leighton said, suffer PTSD. And that can be decades after they've been in prison. If you remember the story about Khalif Broder, he said after he came home, he said he kept a smile on his face and everybody thought he was fine. And Khalif Broder, for people who don't know, is the young man who spent a couple of years in Rikers in solitary. And he was pretrial, as my son was. And when he came home, he said, he tried to be happy-go-lucky and smiling for the people, but he said inside he was a mess. And so he ended up committing suicide. So it's a real struggle. And all these years later, just with my son, he continues to have, days when he's doing okay. And then those days where he's feeling really depressed and intense anxiety and a lot of PTSD. And we have to work through that because, for the first time, really, he told me that there were times when he felt suicidal. He never told me that before. So I was like really, really upset hearing that. And so I struggle with trying to keep him on the good side of life. And he's fortunate that I'm a licensed clinical social worker. So I understand what he's going through and trying to get him through life without being drugged up. And so far, thank God, for a whole year now, he has been without any kind of medication, and he went through a cycle of alcohol and drugs, and he's been clean. So I feel with the hope that we continue to have that, I can get my son back. He feels he'll never be more than 70%. He says that if he can maintain a 70%, then he'll be okay because he feels he'll never be the same after what happened to him. But I remain hopeful that I can get more than 70% of my son back.
I wanted to share a tweet, Barbara. Kathy writes, most people who go to prison eventually get out. Creating trauma and inflicting damage on people while they are incarcerated isn't, quote, correcting anyone or anything. It's time to end this practice. And so I wanted you to respond to that and describe again, there are bills, there is a specific bill that looks to drastically reduce this practice in our state. Can you talk about that?
Well, what Stop Solitary has before the judiciary is what we call the PROTECT Act. And it's really the acronym for an act promoting responsible oversight, treatment, and effective correctional transparency. So number one thing is to stop extreme isolation, period. And that includes not only the people who are in their cells for 22 hours or more a day for punitive measures, which that should never happen. But we're also talking about those prisons where people are locked in a block for over 22 hours a day as a norm. We want to see that end. We want people to have at least 8 hours out of their cell, which means correctional officers now have to work, get some programming in there for people, and try to work toward rehabilitation, because these people will eventually come back home. And when they come back home broken in spirit and mind, now that family and that community has to live with that broken person. So that's what's make our communities unsafe. Another thing we want to do is end all kind of abusive restraints. The story of Carl Talbot, who died in New Haven Correctional 2 years ago this month, he was in 5-point restraints, and they pepper sprayed him and left him in the cell. And when they came back hours later, he was dead. People have to wonder, why would you even have to pepper spray someone who's in 5-point restraints? Because 5-point restraints means you're really chained down. So what is the point of adding to it by pepper spraying them? And then you leave them in there. You're supposed to have, like, I think 15-minute check-ins. If they did that, they would have known that he had died. So we want to end those kind of things from happening. We want to protect social bonds. We're asking for free phone calls. For me, personally, I feel with all the money that the state makes off of the incarcerated people, they work for long hours for 75 cents to $1 a day. And for that alone, the least the state can offer is free phone calls. So I don't see why that's even an issue. Those people who, because of the 13th Amendment, are allowed to be enslaved. So give them free phone calls at least. Another thing we're looking at is making sure the correctional officers are psychologically well. Because if they have these people's lives in their hands, if they're not well, then you can imagine some of the things like Leighton was talking about, where they pretty much do what they want to do to you because you're out of sight, and no one can tell, no one has any oversight over what these people are doing. So we need to make sure they're well. And being in that kind of environment, many people people who went in the system wanting to be helpful, many have left because they couldn't adapt to that kind of abusive environment. But then you also have those who go along with it. And so the whole wellness will help correctional officers who want to do the right thing be able to keep them well and protect their sanity.
Barbara, we heard Kellen say earlier that there's also a measure to ensure accountability and oversight, and
Right.
there'll be a creation of a corrections ombuds. How do you feel about that? Do you think that that's something that could really make a difference?
That's most important, and that's what I was just getting ready to get to. We want to ensure that there's oversight and accountability, because when no one's eyes are on you, you pretty much do what you want to do. So we feel if there was someone inside the ombudsman where incarcerated people can write complaints to, then it'll reduce a lot of the lawsuits going on right now, because with having oversight within the system means some people may not get them all, but some people are going to do things a whole lot better because they know people are looking, where right now no one's looking on what's going on inside.
I wanted to bring Leighton Johnson back into the conversation, also a member of Stop Solitary at CT. You know, in recent years, there have been efforts in Connecticut, in certain prisons, I should say, where there's more emphasis on rehabilitation. There are specific units that reward people who are incarcerated with special programming to help make that transition when they're done with their sentence. I wanted you to talk about that, and also the fact that, is there a way to focus our correctional system on rehabilitation across the board versus this piecemeal effort?
I think that should be the purpose of, corrections. If they're gonna call themselves the Department of Corrections, then they should actually be trying to correct people and sending people back home better, and actually able to be functional contributing members of society. Because if like Ms. Barbara said, if you're sending people home who already, let's be clear, people, the majority of the people who are inside, the racial disparities are not by accident. this is an extended form of slavery, and so and the people who are inside are already come with pre-trauma. So the trauma of just being an oppressed people already, and then you come to prison and have further oppression. So the purpose should be to have more rehabilitative programs and vocational programs, and instead of a punitive approach to things, there should be you know, instead of that, it should be more of a proactive approach to give people treatment and rehabilitation and programs of that nature inside. So, like, I think you spoke to like the True Unit in Cheshire,
Mm-hmm.
which actually is really works from my understanding. I haven't heard of any issues in that unit, and I know actually know a couple of the brothers, the older brothers who are in there who mentor and facilitate that unit and mentor the youth who are coming in with probably long sentences, but they're coming in early, and the ones who are mentoring them are the people who was at one time considered so-called the worst of the worst because of their past, whatever. But these are the people that the units are working because they're giving them a lot of skills that the youth need in order to maintain and cope with the trauma and the behavior from that trauma that they experienced. And then the units work. So more of that should be throughout the entire system.
Leighton, we know that Northern is slated to close. When you heard that news as someone who was formerly incarcerated there, how'd you feel?
Oh, I was excited and elated, and is beyond words of how I felt. But I also was emotional also because like I said, I spent close to 5 years in that place, and it was one of the worst periods in my life. I've never felt as depressed and sad and anxious all the time, like, and just stressed out and to the point of losing my mind. But I had to keep some semblance of sanity and avoid getting on the medications that they give out like candy to disarm people. So I felt very good, but then I also felt that we wasn't done. We got a whole lot more that needs to be done throughout the system, just on a whole, where people needs more time outside of their cells and more programs, vocational, giving them skills and trauma infused programs, also fatherhood programs, a lot of just things so that people could come home with these skills.
Barbara Fair, before we end, I'll ask you the same question. Now that Northern Correctional is slated to close, what do you think should happen to that building?
Definitely demolished. That building just represents too much pain for too many people. And so it needs to be demolished. It never should be used for human beings again. But our like Leighton said, our big job now is to make sure that the practices that were going on in Northern don't just get moved to another facility. And so that's our biggest job right now, is to make sure that doesn't happen. Because what went on in Northern was the place it happened, but that kind of abuse and torture can happen at any facility. And so we want to make sure that we not only shut down Northern, demolish it, get it out of our minds, but that it's not happening in places like Corrigan or Walker or places like that.
That's Barbara Fair, lead organizer and member of the steering committee for Stop Solitary CT. Barbara, thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you for the invite.
And Leighton Johnson, thank you. And Leighton Johnson was also here, also a member of Stop Solitary CT. Leighton, we thank you for your time.
Thank you again for having me.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. After the break, we'll bring back Kellen Lyons. Again, he's a reporter who covers justice for the Connecticut Mirror. Now that the Connecticut DOC plans on closing Northern, what does that mean for the individuals there? You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. With us again is Kellen Lyons, a reporter who covers justice for the Connecticut Mirror. Kellen, there's a lot to unpack there, just hearing from Barbara and Layton alone. I know you covered a public hearing recently where this PROTECT Act was discussed. And I'm curious what the DOC is saying about the practice of solitary, including from leadership, the new DOC Commissioner Quiros.
So it's worth noting that the Department of Correction Commissioner Quiros has 3 decades in the agency. He's not some outside reformer. He's been in the agency for 31 years. He told me as recently as last fall that administrative segregation is an essential tool for prison administrators. And during the public hearing, he said that the simple answer is yes, that's a direct quote, when asked if there were some folks who were so dangerous they needed to be separated from the rest of the population. However, he did say that he was undergoing his own independent review of the restrictive housing policies that the Department of Correction has on the books, which would imply that he recognizes that there's been a public shift, a political shift, and perhaps within the Department of Correction, a philosophical shift and a recognition that perhaps these policies that dictate when people are held in solitary could be and should be revised. And he indicated that he was willing and was in active talks with advocates and family members of the incarcerated to try to increase out of cell time and to try to roll back some of these policies, or at least bring them up to the present day, since they haven't been updated in about 8 years.
It's interesting to hear the commissioner acknowledge a change in philosophy, but how do correction officers feel about these changes, Kel?
Correction officers were not thrilled before the announcement that Northern was going to be closed. I mean, the commissioner has talked at length with me and others about how it's such a difficult decision to choose a correction facility to close because it's changing a correction officer's life, a day-to-day life. You know, they can't put their kid on the bus to go to school each morning because they perhaps have a longer commute, or their shift starts at a different time. Correction officers writ large, they saw Northern as a place that offered flexibility. Northern is a place that was sort of like an ink blot, a Rorschach ink blot for many. Correction officers saw it as a place that offered flexibility to house folks who, during the pandemic, who had tested positive for COVID. I think perhaps some older heads in the Department of Corrections see it as a place that deals with individuals who are dangerous, or quote unquote the worst of the worst, who, you know, in theory pose a threat to themselves or others. And advocates and those who have been incarcerated there see it as this place that is essentially a torture house that's extremely isolating, that exacerbates mental health issues and conditions, and in fact can put people in emotional distress because of how isolating it is. But correction officers themselves, the few that I talked to, had said that it offers flexibility for the DOC system as a whole by sort of being a place that can stand in and house folks who are either a danger to themselves or others, or who at the beginning of the pandemic were sick with COVID.
Barbara Fair made a really good point at the end of our conversation about, while Northern is closing, it's important that these practices at Northern aren't just moved to a different prison. And so I guess that's the whole point of this PROTECT Act, is to really limit solitary confinement to some extreme exceptions. So what are you hearing from lawmakers? Is this the year where they're going to take some of what this is in this bill and make it law, Kellen?
Well, it's worth noting that Stop Solitary isn't the only group that has that concern. There's also an ongoing lawsuit that the ACLU of Connecticut and Disability Rights Connecticut filed dealing with administrative segregation, in-cell restraints at Northern Correctional Institution. That was filed several days before the Northern's closure was announced. And so there's been paperwork filed to try to broaden that lawsuit to include other prisons as well. And that's a lawsuit that the state is seeking to dismiss. There appears to be movement behind this in the Judiciary Committee. There was quite a long public hearing, and the PROTECT Act was scheduled for a long, there were a lot of bills up that day. And the PROTECT Act received a lot of the testimony and in fact started off the day. So it was it looks as though there's movement to try to get the spirit of the PROTECT Act passed. So we'll see.
And again, this is not a full right ban on solitary confinement. Is this a compromise to get lawmakers to agree to ways to drastically reduce it, but yet having this for, say, the people we talked about earlier, the ones who used to be on death row, Kellen?
It appears that way. I mean, it looks as though the correction commissioner was saying that he was doing this on his own and was essentially telling lawmakers to trust me. And the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Gary Winfield, had said that he had heard that from his predecessors before and was reticent to believe that. But it looks as though it doesn't outright ban isolated confinement in general, but it does drastically limit it. There will still be certain special circumstances where that applies. And I had heard from Stop Solitary and from others that the hope is that it will also appear to the special circumstances folks who were formerly on death row, although that may be moot because there was a lawsuit where the Second Circuit Court of Appeals struck down that statute governing their confinement as unconstitutional. So they may blend into a general incarcerated population anyway, or be reclassified and determined to be in a higher security setting.
That's Kellen Lyons, a reporter who covers justice for the Connecticut Mirror, and he's a Report for America core member. Kellen, I really appreciate the context you provided. Thank you.
Thank you.
Today's show is produced by Joe Vasquez and Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. You can learn more about our show, download Where We Live on your favorite podcast app. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel.